Welcome, everybody. This is a humorous history podcast, and we are the Goofy Historians. Today, we are going to start our multi-part series on the Mormons.
The Normans, not the Mormons. It's a different cult.
The Normans. Oh, not okay. So we'll have
You better go back and do some background research. If you've been studying up on the Mormons,
on the wrong
subject. We're not prepared. Wrong. You've been studying up on the wrong subject.
That's okay. I know.
Who knows? Maybe they're related.
I know about both of them, but to be clear, we're going to talk about the Normans. We'll have to swing back around and talk about Steve Young and the golden plates in another video. Okay, seriously. We're going to start our multi-part series on the Normans. This set is going to go from like Alfred's prodigy to the Norman conquest of England, all the way to the Crusades. Now, Joseph might do another video to set that part up. But anyway, we're going to talk about the Normans. Special focus probably on Rollo, who was the first Viking to get concessions from the King of France and start the Duchess of Normandy. We're going to talk about William I, the conquering bastard. And in between those two, there is a king that everybody needs to know about called Canute. And it's either C-N-U-T or C-A-N-U-T-E. Anyway, in my opinion, I think he was probably the greatest king of England, because when he conquered all of England, and he figured out that if you just show up with a big enough army, you don't even have to fight, But anyway, we'll talk more about him. So Rollo was the first Duke of Normandy. He was born in 860 and died in 932 at 72 years old. Think about that. So in the first millennium, somebody living to 72 is pretty amazing. But a Viking living that long must have been amazing. Canute was the king of England and more, but he was lived from 990 to 1035, died at 45. And there's a lot we're going to say about Canute, but there's something I bet you didn't know, Joseph. So Canute was so powerful that he was like, I'm going to stop the tide. Did you hear about this story? And he gets out there with all his people, and he's like commanding the ocean tide to stop. So in that endeavor,
that's a famous story, right? And I just think that's a good contrast between Alfred the Great, who's like baking bread for the old lady, and Canute, who's trying to stop the sea having come. So I don't think, Canute wouldn't have put up with that old lady. He probably would have sent her off to a concentration camp somewhere. He said, "Beg, I'm not watching your case. It's not going to happen."
Well, he shows up. Beg. Canute shows up in the Netflix Vikings movie called Viking Valhalla. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but I started watching that, and Canute shows up in that. And you know what? At this point, you're starting to think the English probably need to be invaded, because they were, after Alfred, things kind of, we're going to talk about it a lot, but it went from Alfred to Ethelred the Unready and stuff. And you know what? At that point, the Vikings were more advanced than the English, it seems like. At least they bathed and they combed their hair back. Anyway, off on a tangent there.
Yeah.
So
they William the mullets.
William the Conqueror was the one who conquered England, obviously. He was born in 1028 and died in 1087 at 59 years old. He was king of England from 1066 to 1087, and he did all the cool stuff we'll talk about. He did the Doomsday Book, right, Joseph? The Doomsday Book was by William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
So the Doomsday Book was insane. It was like categorizing everything, I guess, that they had acquired. Pretty much.
They're down to the cows.
down to the
yeah,
number of
yeah.
cows that the peasants had. Oh my God, these poor peasants during this time. My life must have just been awful because it didn't change who was really, it didn't change much. Who was the ruler? The peasant's life was pretty much the same. But so anyway, what we want to find out is what's the difference between a Norman and a Mormon? And did the Mormons start out as Normans? Did William the Conqueror have some golden plates? Is that how it all started?
No, I don't think so. He had gold probably that he got from the French, right? So,
they had a lot of. They always find these hoards of treasure all across Scandinavia, and you could see how their Vikings just were everywhere. They have hoards of silver and gold from England and Francia, but also from Russia, because their influence. When you, what did I write here? Something about when you pan out, 300 years, the Scandinavian influence from Ireland down to Spain and from Russia all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And it's so crazy to think about.
Yeah. So So if you look at it, in perspective, when we start this whole thing back with, Charlemagne in 800 and his son, which ends up with Charles the Simple giving Normandy to the Normans. I mean, at that time, if you were an alien coming down to Earth, right, you probably wouldn't even notice anything that we're talking about. The only reason it's interesting to us is because we know what happened, right? If you came at that time, you would see the Song Empire in China, which is taking over like a quarter of the globe. You would see the Muslim Empire taking over 50% of the globe, and the Abbasids and the Song Empire and the Umayyads in Spain. That would be huge, and those completely civilized, advanced civilization, right? Between the Far East and Spain, right? And this is like a little tribes fighting each other up in the backwaters at that time, right? So it's not interesting. It's only interesting, because we're the heirs to that. And what happened, a lot of what happened was because of the Vikings, right? If the Spanish, if the Mormons, if the English, the Anglo-Saxons had been left to their own, right? They probably just would have stayed there in their little kingdom fighting, with their four kingdoms until the cows came home. It was only because of the Vikings that actually had metastasized. And then you got a civilization that's seriously competing against the Muslims and the Chinese on the world stage. So what's happened is small potatoes at the beginning, but I think it's the seeds of something that we're still dealing with today, and I think that's huge. Yeah, and it's like what happened with the Normans. Like, what did that happen, right? How did that happen? That the Normans took over, basically European civilization was the foundation of what we're dealing with today, right? It's not.
Yeah, so we could talk a little bit about, I guess you'd call it the origin story of the Vikings. And, there's a couple theories, and they're probably a combination of all of them. But it was interesting that in Scandinavia, well, even in that Netflix series, it shows that the civilization inside Scandinavia, where the Vikings came from, both East and West, was highly culturally very diverse. They had a black queen and all this kind of stuff. But what happened was, I guess, just the amount of land that was available ended up not being enough. And there were sons that ended up like with kings with no land. It reminds me of that Arnold Schwarzenegger old movie, The Barbarian, where he was a king, but he didn't have any land. He was the king of a bunch of men, but he didn't have any land. And so that's kind of the sense that where the Vikings started out, they were, started out as raiders, but it was because they got kicked out of their homeland. And so, yeah, it's interesting. But they adapted wherever they went, that's how they basically disappeared within 300 years. But they didn't disappear. They just absorbed the cultures that they had invaded.
Yeah,
but it's weird how they went
like,
from
like
raiders,
the body snatchers.
right? They went from
Yeah,
raiders,
yeah.
then they became settlers, then they became kings, and in that process, they changed from pagan to Christian.
They became Mormons.
They became Mormons eventually. But yeah, so and then the crazy thing is, they became more Christian than the Christian people that they overtook, that they conquered. They became the most radical, fanatical Christians by that they were, when they took over Sicily and were in the Crusades and stuff like that. The Norman Knights were the state of the art, and kind of gave
so I
to
think
the chivalry.
So if you look at it, Charlemagne, right, was like in the 800s, right? It was before Alfred the Great, and he's the one who created what would become the Holy Roman Empire, which was not Holy Roman or an empire, but it covered most of Europe, right? And that was the exact same time, the 800s, when Charlemagne was around, right? This is when the Vikings showed up, right? And it's almost like the Vikings showed up because there was something to raid, right? Before Charlemagne, there was nothing to raid, right? You had the Merovingians, right, who were like, all you had was these little groups of kings, but nothing to invade, right? Once 800 comes, you have Charlemagne, who's building a civilization, and they're open for business. And also, I think it was because of the global warming period of that time. The Earth was warming, not because of carbon pollution, just because the Earth warms up on occasion, right? So the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, right? They were getting warm and they could plant more foods. Their days were longer, so they populated. Their population grew. And what do you do when your population grows and you have limited resources? You go raiding. And there was somebody to raid. And I think that started the first thing. So when they started raiding the Holy Roman Empire, it was okay when you had Charlemagne, right? He knew even he didn't do that much. He just paid him off, right? And his son, which was Louis the Pious, he paid him off, right? And then there was the sons after that, and who divided up the Carolingian Empire into basically France and Germany, but they were attacking the French part, and by that time they had run out of money. There was nothing left to sell them, and they tried to give them wine because they didn't have any gold, right? So finally, it was. We'll get into this, but it was Charles the Simple. And it's funny. You start with Charles the Great and Charlemagne, right, and you end with Charles the Simple. And he was simple just because he ran out of money. And so the Vikings showed up, which was Rollo. He says, "We're back. We're here for our gold." And Simple goes, "We don't have any gold. We got wine, right?" And he paid him off with wine for a while, right? And then he says, "No, we need gold. We don't need wine." And so he says, "Why don't you just go take Normandy? Please take Normandy." And by that time, that was like the fourth generation of Vikings, from starting with Charlemagne, right? Just as the first generation of Vikings was around the Charlemagne, now you're in Charles the Simple was like the fourth generation, from Charlemagne, right? Your
greatness, the greatness of families are lucky to last 3 generations. There's one story I learned that I didn't know about Charlemagne, the first Christian, Holy Roman Emperor, blah, blah, blah. He killed 45,000 Saxons because they wouldn't.
Yeah, because they didn't convert.
Because they wouldn't convert.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just crazy.
Right. Which
So
is
if you
one of
look
the
at
reasons. So, which is and so they actually blame a lot of that on Constantine, right? Because I mean, there was actually still Celts in Germany area, and so he killed all of those and sent them up to England, and then the Anglo-Saxons came, the Germans came into Germany, and then they got sent to kill the Celts that were in England, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's a whole domino thing, right?
right.
And it's
So
a structure
what's
that's not
amazing to me
maintainable
is that England, you know, after, you know, Alfred the Great's prodigy, I love these. I love the nicknames because you got to know, because they were, a lot of times they were the nicknames that were used in that time. So everybody knew it. These like monarchs just take on this crazy, you know, whatever it is, Ethelred the Simple, or there was one guy called the Trickster. But anyway, it's amazing that they were successful enough to be a target, because, you know, the monasteries had gold, you know, and a lot of treasure. The kingdoms had treasure, but the peasants, which were like 85% or 90%, were just dirt poor. So they were rich, but their wealth was real. It wasn't spread out at all. So once they found a monastery, they were
no, they didn't. They didn't have socialism yet. I mean, that's one of the things. Eventually, the Vikings brought was a type of socialism, right? They brought the laws that eventually became, you know, Norway, Sweden, Denmark today, right? So yeah, it's interesting, right? How one thing leads to another thing, and the reason they showed up is because there was something, right? And it wasn't like they were attacking Christianity. I mean, they raided the monastery because that's where the money was, right? And they took on the Holy Roman Empire because they were rich, right? Not because they were Christian. It's because, you know, it's like, how come
and they were
because that's where the money is.
The Vikings got so filthy rich. They just got crazy. The wealth, because they just kept getting richer and richer.
Yeah, yeah. You know, which is an interesting take on this is that when the Vikings started first they raided, right? The young Vikings raided, and they were just getting the gold, and then they went back and told the next generation there's gold, and they come out with bigger armies, and they have an army, and then finally they start being civilized. Right? And they actually took on the French civilization, right? I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, I tell you what, this is just, we're talking about what we're going to talk about, which is so interesting because I just want to mention this, our very first video that we ever did was called The Battle of Hastings. This was like 3 years ago, before we had any clue on how to even record. And when we go back and listen to it, it was actually not that bad. But I was so confused because I just had one point I wanted to make about the Battle of Hastings, and I didn't really have any background or knowledge or anything about what was going on at the time. And it's funny because you were just like giving background stuff, and I was like, well, okay, but it was only 200 miles to the first battle, and it's so funny. So anyway, 1066, maybe we can find that video and put a link to it. But at least we should have went back 200 years to Rollo. And I still think that we're kind of in that situation because I want to stay on target and go talk about the Normans specifically. And I know you, and you're going to go all the way to Constantine or something. But
no, I'm going way back further than that. I'm going back to the fall of the Western Roman Empire.
But the whole thing is set through a lens of our view of Western civilization, which is so narrow. If even the eastern half of Western civilization, where the Byzantines ruled until Mahmud II, you know, where the Roman Empire didn't fall in the year by 500, even their view of history is so much wider than ours, because we're so focused, generally speaking, in Western civilization that we don't even have the right context of how a Viking came down and had to make a choice to convert to English versus Islam, and he chose Christianity because the Muslims didn't allow alcohol. And the Kievan Rouge, the whole thing about Russia, Vikings started Russia, not the other way around in the Ukraine. You just got to be really clear on that, right? Because if we can get all the way to that point, that is from some controversy that is going on until today. The Kievan Rouge is a story of the Vikings that, from Western civilization, kind of gets glossed over. And remember when I was going to school, sad education that we had back then, the only thing I learned about the Vikings was Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. And those two characters were not even really Vikings. They were more explorers, right?
Yeah, they were later. They were after 1066, right? I mean, they were already Christianized, which you don't realize. So both of them were Christians, and they were. It's funny. They were at the end of this global warming period, right? So when they went, because they were still exploring, right? They were exploring up north, going into Greenland and Iceland and the northern parts of America. And when that was like the end, so it was still warm. They went in there and planted crops and stuff, right? And they go, we're civilized, and the Eskimos were there, right? Or whatever you call them now. I think they have a better name for them. But they're going, you got to learn to live in the snow. And they go, no, man, we don't live in the snow, man. We're Christians. We're going to plant crops. And then it got cold. That global warming came to an end, right? And they were totally unprepared for the ice that was returning. And so that was the end of their northern. They actually starved to death because the oceans froze again, and they just abandoned these whole tribes of Northmen who had become French. Right? The French are not going to. The original Vikings would have survived, but Vikings that had become French and went to finishing school and spoke French, they're not going to survive in the North.
So yeah, that's interesting. And that was even a joke. I love that medieval people had a sense of humor, because the whole idea that so Iceland was already named, and then when they got to Greenland, they had to come up with a name, and they couldn't call it more icier land, so they just went the other way and called it Greenland. And so people were like, really, is it green? And they're like, you bet, it's very green. Go see.
It's gonna be green for another 10 years, so you better hurry up, right? So I want to end with one funny story.
Okay,
because we're gonna run out of time, right?
We got we
have to finish something funny, right? Yeah, I have to be quick. So William the Bastard became William the Conqueror, right? He conquered England, was there for 10 years, but he was still Duke of Normandy, right? And so when they went up there, he was in England, the French go, oh my God, let's take Normandy back, right? So they're kind of, because, King's up in England, we're busy with England, the Doomsday Book. So the French are coming up to take France, Normandy back, right? And he goes, no, man, you can't do it. So he comes back, he's fighting, this is when he's 10 years later. He goes back to Normandy to fight the French, right? And by this time, he had 10 good years in England, and he is so fat by this time, it's hard for him to get on a horse, right? They have to crank him up and sit him on a horse, right? And then he's gonna go fight the French, right? And he goes there, he actually beats the French, but he's so fat, his saddle falls off and he dies, right? Because his saddle has this little thing on it. He stabs himself with his saddle, right? And so they take him. So they take him back to his place in Normandy, right? And 10 years ago, right, he was preparing his chapel for when he died, right? And he got this gold coffin in this beautiful church, right? And it was all made for him, right? So he could be worshipped when he died or something. So they brought him back to this coffin. But remember, they made this coffin 10 years ago, right? And now he's fat. He doesn't fit. He doesn't fit in the coffin. And so they're bringing him in. They're going to fit him into the church. The mass is going on. And they're going, my God, he doesn't fit. He doesn't friggin' fit. And so by this time, it's been a few weeks, right? So like they have to kind of like push him in, right? Get the fat to roll in, right? And they're like trying to squeeze the top on, and he explodes because he's been dead for a week. And all this pus and everything goes all over the church, and so the priests go, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" So they go through, let's just finish the mass as quickly. So they put the mass on like triple time. They finished as fast as they could, and they all ran out, right? And then the peasants who don't give about how things smell, right? They've been smelling this stuff all their life. They come in, take his gold, his clothes, his little shoes. He takes everything and leave him naked in this too small coffin, bloated. And that was how the inglorious end of William the Conqueror.
Oh no, that's a great place to end this video because we're out of time.
Goofy Historians is the funnest place to learn about history. Or is it the funniest? Does history repeat itself? Not really. But sometimes it kind of rhymes.